Welcome to tonight's program featuring Dr. David Lewis. And to begin this evening, we are going to introduce Marta Clifford, an elder from the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, who will be opening the evening with a blessing. Dr. Lewis's research essays about the histories of the tribes are published on the blog site ndnhistoryresearch.com. And he has traveled from Salem tonight to join us. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David G. Lewis to our community.
Can you hear me? Does it need to be closer? Is that better? Oh, much better. All right, so great to be here. Good to see a very vibrant audience here. Something like 300 and something people here. We did a straw count, and it's like about that many. You and your neighbors are all here, so you can look out for them right now if you really want to. So that's great. Thank you for again inviting me so well. This is my first presentation of the season, actually my first presentation about my book. I've mentioned it on a few occasions, but I really haven't talked directly about it. And I may not talk much about it today because, you really gotta wait for the book. But there's a couple things that, I've been doing since then that I'll talk about. And I guess I'll move it to, okay, here's the page for my book. It's a gratuitous buy my book page. So it's available for pre-order on Amazon. I'm not sure, there's a couple of places that have it too. I don't think you can order it from the William Press yet, from their website, but there you go. I think the cover will sell the book more than the interior part. So that's an exciting cover. You can mount it and put it on your wall, never having read it, and you'll be happy probably. So I'm sure Greg Robinson, the artist, will be very happy about that. So and that's again mid-November. This mic is just not obeying. Okay, is that better? Okay. All right, so introducing some peoples here. First off, just to set some context, I like to show people where everybody is. And so I'm gonna walk away from the mic, so I'll have to yell at you. So this area is the Tualatin area of the Willamette Valley. These are Tillamook lands. Most of the rest are all Chinook lands, different Chinook tribes all the way down to the Chutes area. The only other one would be the Clatskanie, which were Athabascan speakers. So this is a 1851 mock-up from their treaties, which were never ratified, but this is what the lands from at least about right here that was claimed by all these tribes in 51, including the Tillamook on the coast. So you can see there was not just one Chinook tribe. There were multiple Chinook tribes. They were different bands. They're all part of the same culture group, same language group, but they had different leaders and had different territories. And a few tribes like the Tualatin and Clatskanie and Tillamook were in there too. So just imagine this as a more complex understanding of the area than simply labeling the Columbia Chinook. In the same manner, let me get over here fast enough. The Calapooians were a lot of different tribes. I think there's some estimates there were at least 18, 19 of them before colonization, for settlement. This is the arrangement about the time of treaties. And you see Tualatin and Clackamas obviously is not Calapooia. It was a Chinook tribe, but the rest of them are all Chinooks except for the ones on the far east side, which are Molalla. Those people are also part of the Willamette Valley. So if we can't say the Willamette Valley is only a place of Calapooians, that's not true. We had quite a bit of Molalla people here too, and we had Clackamas in the area too. And then we had all these people who traveled through the valley as well. But the majority of the valley was owned and controlled by the Calapuyans. And you can see that squiggly line in the middle is kind of the dividing line between the east and west side of the valley. That's the Willamette River. And so that was kind of where tribes were divided. There was a population of about 16,000 or a few more maybe Calapuyans in the valley before settlements happened. Within the period of a few years after settlement, people went through a disease cycle which destroyed most of them, and we'll talk about that in a minute too. Let's move on. So Calapuyans have a very old history. In our oral histories that you can find online, other places in books, we have these stories that I pulled out the story of people being forced to run to. It says all the people were running along. They climbed up a big mountain because there was a big flood coming, and they went to the very loftiest mountain, and it was Mary's Peak. The water pretty nearly got to the top of the mountain, and the water did not want to go back. And so this is the story, I believe, of the people witnessing, experiencing the Missoula floods. And those of you that have read about that at all, good for you. But if you haven't heard about the Missoula floods, and most of you probably haven't, it was a giant flood cycle. It lasted for several thousand years. There were perhaps hundreds of thousands of these floods that came through as the glaciers were sort of like weakening when they got warmer, and they started letting loose water. And you know, millions of hectares of water came down through the Columbia Gorge, carved out the Columbia Gorge, and brought all the soils from western Washington to the Willamette Valley, where the water settled. And eventually went out to the Pacific. But the soil from western Washington, that we literally stole from western Washington, settled in the valley here, and to a point of some places it's about 100 meters deep. So in this area it's probably more like 30 to 50 meters deep, but in some places much deeper, maybe towards the Columbia. So that's these stories are very old then, perhaps as old as 16,000 years. I don't know what other people have 16,000 year stories you can sort of prove, but that's pretty old, and that's they were surviving. They figured out how to survive through that, and then we realized, start thinking about this. There's a lot of places you could survive in the valley with the floodwaters coming in. All the buttes in the valley are above the sort of 400-foot threshold of the floodwaters, and so you could actually then spend some time, maybe a week or so, on top of a butte while you're waiting for the floodwaters to recede and then survive up there. So there may be that those may have all been refuges for the Calapuyans and other people. And that's so that brings into a larger sort of context this meaning behind these floodwaters, and it starts to illustrate something about Native culture and persistence. How do you have your oral history survive upwards of 16,000 years? That's pretty amazing. So anyway, it's we have yet to find archaeological evidence that old in the valley, and anybody can hazard a guess why you can't find that really old 16,000 year.
Decays.
No, not quite. Berry, there you go. 50 to 100 meters of soil is on top of all that stuff, and there really is no way right now to figure out how to get to it, where the sites are, and you're not going to do test pits like that are 100 meters deep. So so we just don't know. We have very late history, 8,000 years and later, in the valley, but we don't know what the culture was like, what the people were like at all previous to the floods, and how far back that goes. So that's some context there for you. That's kind of the theory that I sort of have been working on, and going to go with it for a while and see how that works for me. We also have documents that talk about how we lived our lives. This is a Kalapuya calendar from the Tualatin people. It was collected at Grand Ronde Reservation in 1877 by Albert Gatchett. Gatchett kind of drew it up nicely, and I went through with Photoshop, cleaned it all up because it had a lot of photocopy marks in the middle of it. But it lays out pretty nicely 12 months of the year. It talks about how they had a previous 6-month calendar, and then they changed to a 12-month calendar when the settlers arrived. And all of it's really based upon following plant cycles around. They're following either Wapato or camas cycles. And in the calendar, they don't talk about only harvesting camas once, but possibly twice, because they talk about harvesting in the 7th month, which is first spring. That's like April, right? And then now the camas is ripe down here in the middle of the summer. So that's a possible 2 times to harvest camas. And then the Tualatins otherwise have other stories about even harvesting later in the summer, about the time they're gathering acorns too. So that's 3 times. So I've heard many stories from Native people that we only harvest camas once. I don't think that's true. Not for this valley, at least. We had plenty of camas, huge fields of camas. In fact, on the GLO maps, there's a big area just south of here, out towards Cottage Grove, along the highway. I think people could see the camas swale signs and stuff. That was actually a giant camas patch in the middle of this big field, like big field. And so people would go there a couple times a year probably and harvest camas there, and it was a pretty major crop. So this whole line of reasoning leads me to think, well, maybe harvesting plants like this, harvesting roots was more important to the tribes than hunting or fishing. The root plants were really reliable. I mean, you couldn't really destroy them with fire. They were underground. They're always there. They grew in huge, plentiful patches. You didn't have to do any kind of real work on them to get them to grow again. They're wild plants, so they grow again every year and they expand. And so that was probably a pretty major crop, principal crops of the tribes. And hunting always could happen. Fishing could happen a couple times a year, but on the Willamette and tributaries, there aren't as many sort of fishing falls. So it wasn't as big of an activity as harvesting, plants and things. So, I've been thinking that maybe their diet was as much as 75% vegetables because of that, with the addition of some meats and things, which they absolutely wouldn't refuse. They wouldn't refuse to go hunting and stuff. It was easier to do all the harvesting of the plants and things. So that's some of the things you can kind of learn from the past, from these previous research in the past, more than 100 years ago. And then through this research, I put together a seasonal round calendar, what the year may have looked like for the tribes in the valley. And each of the seasonal rounds for each tribe is going to be somewhat different. But this would be Kalapuyan seasonal round, where the things that were important to them and when they would have gone and do these things. And so we see this full year layout for the tribes, where they would travel 20 miles, 40 miles at the most probably to go to places, to harvest things, to hunt, to fish, to trade. And through the winters were much harsher back then. So they would stay in the winter villages, the winter houses, for much more of the winter time than we do today. And they would live off of the preserved, dried foods that they had done throughout the rest of the year. And it's pretty clear in their stories, the Kalapuya stories, that they would dry out just about everything and then rehydrate it in the wintertime for food. Not too different from the culture that came to here, the settler culture who harvested stuff, canned it, and then would use it in the wintertime when there's nothing really growing. So that's not so different really, but they just did it with wild foods. It had different methods. This thing is just not hot. Okay.
What's Eula?
That's a Willigan fish, a smelt. So the smelts would come in some places are in January, late January, February, and there still runs today on the Sandy and the Cowlitz River. The rivers with sandy soils like that, and so they come in the millions, and then you can just harvest them with nets and things. And you can still buy them today. I think there was a run this summer or this year. People sell them to like Fred Meyer, and they freeze them up and put them in packages. You can buy them and stuff. But those are all still. A lot of these are still things that are here today. There's not as many of them, and we've kind of destroyed the environments, and we'll talk more about that for these things. So here's some more detailed pictures of Wapato and Camas, and we have some of the native names up here, Momptu and Antip, which is the names for Camas. And the way that Kalapuyan puts together nouns is they put an A or an A-N in the beginning of the noun. So that means it's kind of a noun. The probably means the. And then, so the actual word for Camas is T-I-P. So it's tip. So Antip is the Camas. So, and Nulik, the, Wapato, things like that. So that's actually acorn, sorry, and Nulik, the acorn. So, and that's the case with tribes and with just any noun in the language. It starts with A or A-N in front of it. So those are some of the products that we would harvest. There's camas on the bottom down there. Once you peel off the layers of camas, it's white. And so you can actually cook that in underground ovens, or you can bake it or boil it. And it comes out really nice and sweet, kind of a treat. And I like the flowers because they're very pretty, but it also tells me, how healthy the camas is in any one area by seeing so many flowers. And here's your Wapato, which was, actually used by a lot of settlers that came in the area. They call it Indian potato, and it was substituted for potato for the first few years before they grew potatoes. And so people liked it. I mean, it's still actually it's a product that, the only place I found it for sale is in Chinese grocery stores. I actually went by my house, this is a true story. A quarter mile from my house, there's a Chinese grocery store in Salem. And I went in there and I was looking around all the vegetables. I'd never been in one, and I'm like, that is Wapato. And it was in a shrink wrap package with, plastic on top, and there was no label on it. Just a price, and so I'm like, that is absolutely Wapato. So it was very weird. Okay, we're working on restoration. We'll talk more about that in a minute too. So, all right. So like I said, Kalapuyas have oral histories of using these plants. This one talks about people digging holes for acorns, where they sort of float their acorns to get rid of the tannins, and maybe dry them out. Later on, they use the same holes for, they build a fire there and they cook their camas. The camas would take 3 or 4 days to cook in those holes. So if they're doing it in their acorn holes, it's gonna have to be about the same time as they collect acorns. And so I would guess that they're getting the same camas in the same field as there's lots of oak trees. And so we see these environments appear in the valley today. I think they've been preserved because people like oaks, so that they've also been preserving the camas under the oaks. So we see Let me show you the next one. So like this area of Bush Park in Salem is a pretty nice, the whole park is sort of like covered with camas at 3 different levels under oak trees. And so it's pretty nicely preserved because that park has never been, developed at all. It's never been plowed. So we have a lot of camas there that probably are the original crop of camas and some of the original oak trees that date back to the 1850s or so. Tribes would absolutely, burn the land. The stories that I've been looking at, they burn the land in about late August and September, clearly burning has a potential of, nowadays potential of causing a lot of harm. But back then, there wasn't a lot of houses in the way, so people would burn on an annual basis all the prairies, just to sort of clear off the underbrush and to create, forage for deer so they know where they were coming, so they could kill them easier. And so, and to kind of, add nutrients to the soil. They knew that the plants would grow better after a fire episode. Oak trees grow more acorns after fire, like a year or two after fire. So basically they're doing it to create more food, create more forage, and to be able to, I'm thinking the first reason would be to walk across the land, because if you don't do that in Oregon, the vegetation just goes nuts. So you really have to clear it out, otherwise you're walking through bramble in Oregon. So fire was absolutely used, and we are in various places experimenting to bring it back to the valley to help with restoring native species and to perhaps protect the rest of the valley and our settlements from other fires that are accidentally set. So one of the really interesting records that we found recently is this Wilkes Expedition Records, the Henry L. Journal. Never been published. The Wilkes journals were published, but I don't think, he didn't come down in the southern expedition down to California. He went up north on the Columbia. So beyond Salem, he didn't experience any of the land. So Wilkes appears to not access the Eld or the Dana or the other journals for that expedition that came down through this area, down through like basically West Eugene. That was the area they came down through, and they were drawing what the land looked like, and they were writing out their descriptions of things. And they have this Long Tom Buff, which is the Long Tom River, and they have a place name they pulled out, La Malie. They pulled that right out put that in their journals, and none of that information got into Wilkes' published account, but it's in these unpublished journals. And it means really that there was quite a bit of wetland area in this area. So much so they had a name for it, La Malie. It means a wetland to the tribes. And that's what I think. We haven't really, looked at it really closely to see what it may mean, but I think that's exactly what it means. It means an area of wetland, an area of sort of water, and they wrote in the journals, and so we have that now. So that gives us a lot of indication of what this land was like before, settlement, before the tribes were moved. In the north, down to at least Salem, there was quite a bit of Wapato, like we mentioned. Wapato grew in the Portland Basin in huge quantities. All of these stars on this map of the Columbia down into the Portland area are locations where you would have had Wapato, where there are what appears to be ponds or lakes or wetlands on islands or on the shore. So these are all going to be Wapato areas. We know that Wapato grows pretty good on Salvia Island. And looking more closely at the Columbia around Blue Lake, Natchitoches was the village at Blue Lake. All these lake structures, all these watery structures would have been swampy areas that would grow wapato. And the Lewis and Clark expedition, if you want to get those journals for free online or wherever, talks about this. They come into the towns here, they see people packing up and getting ready to go upriver again, and they note that the people are there, the Chinook people are there in these villages in this area throughout the wintertime. They get there in like October for the wapato. Not for fishing, but for wapato. And then once the winter's over, in about April, they pack up everything, like their houses and everything, walls, boards, everything, and they take it back upriver or down upriver, and they put them up again at places like Cascade Locks, Cascade Rapids today, and they reset up their houses, and they're getting ready for the great salmon runs of the summer. So, and those two images on top are what I call wapato canoes. They were actually drawn into the Lewis and Clark journals because they were small canoes made for one person, and they theorized, and it's probably true, they were used by the women to go gather wapato. So they would float the canoes in the water, and they would go into the water themselves with poles, or it talks about maybe using their toes, and then prying up the wapato from the floor of the water, and then putting them in the canoes as their catch basin. So that's pretty interesting. Tells you a lot about tribal culture in the Portland area and sort of seasonal movements of the tribes back and forth. And like I said, all of these foods would be subject to storage. They would dry them up. Even salmon would be dried. They would dry it and grind it into a powder. That powdered salmon would be used in soups and stews because people would sort of cook soups and stews in their baskets that held that, they cooked them in actual woven baskets, and they would put in things like tarweed seeds and dried fruits in there, and they would make they had their recipes. They'd make things, and they would do this in midwinter, and so this was a pretty common, pretty vibrant activity that was really heavily interrupted by settlement. Settlement brought in a lot of changes to the land, including taking away a lot of food sources, and they could no longer, constantly be putting food away and in their winter house and then rely upon that through the wintertime. We'll talk about more of that in a minute too. So we're back to the disease. So smallpox probably hit the area in around 1790s, maybe 1780s. Nobody knows for sure when, but we know that there was an epidemic then. Probably wiped out something like a quarter of the people. There was a rebound, so by 1830, most of the population had rebounded. But by that time, malaria hit the area, probably brought in by fur traders. Not necessarily the mosquitoes, but they had malaria in their body, and the mosquitoes in the area would have picked up that disease and carried it around to all the people. And there was enough wetland, watery areas in this area, all throughout the valley, that I've seen, that there's plenty of mosquitoes. So they would have probably began infecting populations going south. I think the population here may have gotten hit maybe a year after, or a year or two after the northern populations, but that's my own sort of theory. But the people were depopulated to the point of 90 to 97%. So it really truly was a pandemic for the Calapooians and many of the other tribes in the area. And they basically were just about wiped out. Kind of depopulating the valley to the point where they had to sort of concentrate themselves down to just a few villages and maybe less bands than they had before. If they had 10 villages, they were down to 1 for each tribe. So that's pretty significant. And we see that in the settlers' accounts from the area. If you read any of these settlers' accounts when they come into the area, a lot of settlers saying there's no Indians here, there's no Indians except for on the rivers, always Indians on the river, because they had concentrated themselves down to the river settlements on the Willamette, and all the other areas off the Willamette were basically abandoned. So that's pretty significant. That would cause massive changes to culture, massive changes to their ability to protect their valley. And so we see in that era not just settlement by Americans in the area, but we see attempts by the Klickitat and the Cowlitz to come down and take over villages that were abandoned by the Chinook even the Klickitat even claimed they had conquered the valley and owned the valley at one point, which is not true, but they claim that. And so we see a lot of attempts to take advantage of the vulnerability of the tribes after disease. And clearly the Americans were a lot more successful than the others were. So settlement took lands from tribes, began to force tribes off their lands, began changing the environment for agriculture. Due to the reduction of native people to diseases caused a lack of ability to defend their tribal territories, and rapid settlement took land, food, and freedoms from tribes without any recompense. There was no attempt to try to pay back the tribes for the time that the settlers had taken their land without legal precedent. There was no legal claim to this land until the treaties were signed and ratified by Congress. And that was about 25 years from the time of first settlement to the first treaty was ratified. So there was never an attempt to recompense the tribes for that. No attempt to pay for illegal settlements for decades. Some tribes opted to fight. The Rogue Rivers, the Yakimas, the Walla Wallas, Paiutes chose to fight back. Even I think the Tillamook's did at one point. But the Calapooias never did. They were so reduced in population. And I think that part of the culture in this area, because they were pretty heavily integrated with some level with the Chinook people in the area, the culture was a economic trade system. So a lot of the tribes in this area saw opportunity with settlers. They saw all these new things coming at them. They saw fabrics, and they saw guns, and they saw metals, and they saw all these cool new things that were at first sort of wealth items. Only the wealthiest could afford them. Later on, they became regular trade items in the area. And so they saw themselves perhaps getting rich off the trade with the settlers, with the explorers, with the fur traders, and they wanted to keep everything peaceful in the area. So I think that helped sort of the tribes to adjust to this new economy that came at them. And we see the Calapooians and a lot of the Chinook people not committing any acts of war or aggression upon the settlers because they are hoping they're going to get wealthy or get something from the settlement. There are clearly some acts that other folks attempt, but I've not found any accounts right now of Calapooians really do anything truly violent where people were killed, even in the Eugene area. So, but settler agriculture changed the land dramatically from a native landscape full of food and nice flowers to wheat, which is not flowery at all. So sorry, but so I think I like this picture over here better. I don't know about you, but anyway. So I just wanted to offer that juxtaposition so you see kind of what we're talking about here. So once the agriculture began taking over the whole valley, and it's thought that by 1852, most of the valley was actually taken by some settler as a land claim. They were putting it all in agriculture. So right about that time, all the land in the valley was claimed, and most of it was being put into agriculture. So think about how many native food sources were being taken away at that point. Because it's not just the plants, the camas and wapato and whatever, there's other root plants too, but it's also things like, well, we're fencing in our land, so we don't want you to come into our fence area, where you can't travel across our land because of that. And the settlers are also really good hunters, so they have guns and stuff, so they're out hunting. They all like to eat venison and stuff and elk. And then a lot of them are fishermen too, so they're setting up their own fishing operations. And so it isn't just the plant life, it's everything is being taken by tens of thousands of settlers at some point and taken away from the tribes who really depend on those things for their living. So we see what happens in around the 1850s, we see people, the tribes being called vagrants and nuisances and thieves in the valley. We see lots of accounts of that. And I don't doubt it. You know, all their land is being taken away. At this point, before 1855, none of the treaties have been ratified. So they technically own all the land. And yet, there's no food for them. All the land is being put into agriculture. They have nothing to live on. So they have to sort of lend their labor to the settlers to help build their farms, which they do. There's lots of stories of tribes helping build farms and building and supplying fence staves and learning animal husbandry and farming and stuff. The Tualetons are famous for that. But once the farm is built, and once more Americans come into the area, you'd rather hire an American you can speak to than a native you can't. Tribes were less useful, and they became kind of like homeless vagrants in the valley. And so they were wandering around on the roads, looking for work, looking for food, sometimes looking for handouts. I found lots of stories up in, Brownsville area, people, having Native people come to their house and asking for handouts and stuff. And sometimes, most times they're being refused because, the settlers, for whatever reason, were not willing to share what they had with the tribes. And so they began stealing. They began, killing cattle, stealing horses at times, stealing food, stealing whatever is not tied down because they're starving, because they don't have any food, they can't put anything away for the wintertime. There's no place for their village to be, so they're constantly in this itinerant, moving around the landscape, trying to find food and find place for them to remain. And so when treaties come along, it's no wonder that they chose to accept to sell their land and move to a reservation where they'd be protected somewhat and be somewhat safe and get some food than remain in the valley where there was nothing for them. So I wanted to throw a few slides in there from my recent research. I was hired by the Whitaker Neighborhood Association to do a native study of the Eugene area of their neighborhood, but it's hard to get down to a neighborhood level. So I had to do all of Eugene and much of Springfield in the area. So we have these statements about the valley. This is the character of the valley, environmental character of the valley. It says, Hallie Huntington said, they're always telling Skinner that he should build higher in the hill because the big water would come and get him sure, but he was all he lost was all his livestock, his cattle. He saw all of his livestock there swimming desperately down the river. So this story talks about how the tribes told Skinner he should build on the side of the butte, which he did, away from the water. And then his cattle was running down on the plain, and there was a flood, and so he lost his cattle one year because he didn't listen to the tribes. So, and then this other one from Ethan Newman. The site of Eugene at the time was really very wet. Several sloughs across the area, and it was sort of marshland. It was quite wet underfoot. I did not appeal to them a whole lot, so they went up the valley and crossed the coast fork and settled at what was named Pleasant Hill. So this is Bristow and other folks, Elijah Bristow. They chose also not to live on the plain on the lower, but instead moved uphill, kind of up the side of the foothills of the Cascades to the point where it wasn't as watery, and that's where he established Pleasant Hill. Again, both of these are stories that talk about literally the environment influencing where you place your town, or the tribes, From Martha Goodrich, one account describes the grass of the Willamette Valley belly high to the animals, another that it was so lush and tall it could be tied over a horse's back. Cornelius Hills. At the present site of Springfield, not even a shack was to be seen, though huge trees with the roots intact were well scattered. Elizabeth Wilkinson. Wayne's dad did not clear the land when he first came in here. It was full of stumps. You see the Indian burnt this out and left those big old growth stumps. So there's your Indian burning there. So the tribes had been burning out the land, and the trees that were not fire resistant were burnt. So there were a bunch of stumps. And then here's some information about the tribe that was here, and that was kind of figured out. It was the Chafin Band. Sometimes they're called Chiffin Band. There's different ways of spelling their name. Baker says many people took the land from the Indians, but Joel Inman paid them for the land that he acquired. And part of the agreement was that he was able to take care of this petty chief, and I believe the chief's name was Skookum John, which is Strong John. And part of the rest of that story says that they would pay them every year, that the Indians would come around every year and demand something from the garden, some sort of tribute as kind of their rent, I guess, for the land. Kinsey says, Skinner, the Indians in the vicinity took umbrage on the white man and his family, thus locating in their midst, and several times sought to destroy them. The attempt at intimidation on the part of Chief Tom and his associates having proved a signal failure. They just made it look like they were really angry at the Skinners and made a lot of noise. It didn't scare them away, and the Calipuians eventually gave up. Whitaker says the Indians, about 30, had never seen white people and thought they were going to Mimaloose to die because they were so white. His third attempt to persuade Mr. Skinner to smoke the piece of pipe. So Mimaloose, I don't know if you've heard of Mimaloose Island. It's an island in the Columbia where a lot of the tribes in the Columbia would place their dead out in the open. It was widely looted by folks that want to sell Indian remains. But the name Mimaloose is probably a Chinookwawa term, a Chinook jargon term for a dead person, or so they thought the white skin was very suspect. And then Elijah Bristow. I threw this in here because Bristow was a little bit of a violent character. No real Indian wars occurred in the vicinity. Elijah never let them get beyond their incipiency. A band of Klamaths made their appearance in the borders of Elijah's place and made a few threats. The pioneer took down his long-barreled rifle and fired. The Indian tumbled but got away. A few days later, a friendly Mala came to the settlement and said the wounded Klamath had died the following day. So Bristow was not going to take anything from anybody, and he has a number of events in my report where he was a pretty violent character to the Indians. And so, and this exact event, it states later on, it says that they chose, because they had a discussion with Bristow about this, how they can make it good. Because in tribal culture, even if you commit a murder or you commit some sort of crime, theft or whatever, you could always pay that off. It's not like in our culture where you go to jail, you can spend 10 years in jail and you get out. No, you can always pay it off. If you have enough horses, you have enough stuff, you can always pay it off. And then make it good with the person that you've wronged or the family you've wronged if it's a death. So they tried to do that with Bristow, and he was so angry and so threatening to them, they decided to leave the valley and did not come back for some 25 years. And the Klamath had been coming into the valley every year, it seemed like, hanging out with the Molalla people. There's lots of stories of them doing that, coming in and hunting out elk. They liked to hunt elk. This valley was full of elk. And both the Klickitats from the north and the Klamath from the south came into the valley to hunt elk, which has to mean there was a lot of elk here. And so the settlers don't like the Klamath being here. They said this is not your place, and always tried to drive them back to southern Oregon. So that's a problem. So that's a story of Bristow. So by 1853, there began to be treaties in Oregon. Began to buy the Americans finally began to buy the land from the tribes. kind of in the midst of, like we said, a lot of threatening action, a lot of violence, a lot of conflict. And more often than not, the tribes would not be on the winning end of those conflicts because, and I've written about this on other occasions if you want to ask me later, if you were a tribal person in Oregon and you sort of witnessed a crime, like a murder or whatever, the courts would normally throw out the case if somebody brought the case to court, because the judges would not be able to understand the Native people who spoke their own language, and because they then wouldn't be able to hear the testimony first person, they would just throw it out. So Palmer, the Indian Superintendent of Oregon, in that time period, basically was very upset about that. He said that, white people can get away with any crime and there is no justice for the Native people at all. On the other hand, if a Native person did anything, they would absolutely pay, or all their people would pay. There were absolutely attempts to commit genocide on tribes, and many tribes were nearly completely genocided for the theft of a horse. So there's some unequal justice things going on there. But by 1853, we start to see treaties come along. Tribes begin to sell their land because of these pressures. We see the Roy River treaties come around in 53 and 54, the Umpqua and Kalapuya Treaty in 54, and the Shasta Costa Treaty in 54. Those are all down south. And then we see the Willamette Valley Treaty not happen until 55. The reason why it happened so late is because there was a lot more conflict in the south, in the gold region, than there was in the Willamette Valley. There was a lot more friendliness in the valley. There was less fighting. The Calapuyans were trying to get along with and change their culture and work with the settlers than there was in the south. And so by 55, they put together a big omnibus treaty called the Willamette Valley Treaty, or Kalapuya Settler Treaty, that included the Chinooks on the north, all the Calapuyans in the valley, and all the Molalla people in the valley, and even the Clatskanie. And the last treaty was the Southern Molalla Treaty of 55. But the Willamette Valley Treaty is pretty interesting. There's actually 2 pages missing from it, and have been missing for about 170 years. And I noticed these 2 treaty pages, signature pages, in the federal records on microfilm, and I was like, where do they belong? And so, because they were with tribes that were not mentioned in any other treaty anywhere. So I finally figured out that they were missing from the Willamette Valley Treaty. They had arrived late after it had been ratified in March 3rd of 1855, and so they were never added onto the treaty. But they included the Mountain Band of Molalla, where they are up there. Mountain Band of Molalla up here on the Coast Fork. Another band of Santiam, the Santiam Forks Band of Molalla, the Clatskanie, and the Nepechuk, which are the descendants of the Multnomah people. So pretty significant land bases, and probably about half of the Western Cascades would be their land claim. So we have all that now. After treaties were signed, Joel Palmer began a process of moving people to reservations, permanent reservations. Most of the treaties did not assign permanent reservations. They just kind of mentioned temporary reservations until they could figure out a permanent reservation later. So in the south, they began Table Rock, and then in the Umpqua Valley, the Umpqua Reservation. They had reservations on the coast in the south, and they were slowly being brought up to what became the Coast Reservation. In 55, the permanent reservation that was named in the summer was the Great Coast Reservation, but it had never been sort of settled, and there was no development of roads or anything. So Palmer had to figure out another location for the tribes because there was a lot of conflict. The Rogue River War was happening in the south, the Walla Walla War was happening in the north. Had to figure out what to do with all these people, because the settlers were basically writing editorials in newspapers saying, the only thing to do with these natives is to wipe them all out, to exterminate them. So he figured out he had to find another land base that was a little more accessible to supplies and resources that he could control the action. So he decided late in 1855 to place them at the Grand Ronde Indian Reservation, which he had just created in like late November 55. So in order to prepare for that, he placed all the Calapooians in the valleys and the Molalla people on small temporary reservations or reserves. There was one at Spore's property, there was one in the Mohawk Valley, one over in the Muddy Creek area. There was one at Tekapa near Brownsville. There was two in the Santiam area, which is, one in the middle of, I think it was the middle of Lebanon. One out by Sayo. There was a number of others in the north, and then so that all happened in about March of 55. By October, he, through the summer, he was dealing with the war problem in the south. In October, he decided to move everybody, and he began ordering movements. The tribes here were concentrated at Spore's Ferry, which is, the park now, and Spore's basically took care of them for a few months until they could be moved over to Corvallis. Corvallis became the central hub for all the tribes in the South Valley on the north side, on the east side and west side. They all concentrated there. They waited for the steamer Kanema, and they were transported to Dayton, where Palmer had his office and his land claim. From Dayton, they spent a couple days there, were fed, were counted, and then were taken by wagons to Grand Ronde down the road. It took about a day to get there. So by late April into May, all the Calapooians and Molalla people were at Grand Ronde of 1856. So that's how removal happened. And the North had a different process. And then there were other trips of people coming from Table Rock and Umpqua that came up through the valley and ended up going to Grand Ronde as well. They walked up through the valley. So I don't know if I need to go to move on Chinookans. They came down to Lot Whitcomb, who started, I think, was it Milwaukee? He was in charge of that northern area, and he had also some steamboats because he built them, and he basically gathered them up on a steamboat and brought them all down to Oregon City, and from Oregon City they were placed on a barge that were taken to Dayton, and the next process. So that's what happened there. He brought people from the north, from the Columbia, all the way down on his steamboats. And I already talked about that. That's the only picture of the Kanema we have. It's not really a picture, it's a drawing. But it says Kanema on the side. So there's no picture of Kanema that we found so far. And that's those are your Spores people. Jacob and his wife, I think, was it Mary or Elizabeth? Elizabeth, that's right. So at Grand Ronde, the Calapooians were placed mainly in this upper valley here, this upper prairie. The Tualatans are over there in the corner, and the rest of the Calapooians and Molallas are down here, but the rest of the Calapooians are up here. All of the Rogue Rivers and Umpquas are placed down here in these villages. These are encampment sites, these little teepee structures. Campsite, 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 campsite. So one of these areas was probably Rogue River, the other one was Umpqua. Because there was always a plan to move these people at some point to the Coast Reservation. The Grand Ronde was planned to be the reservation for the Calapooians and the people of the Calapooia, etc. treaty. So the Molallas are going to stay, Calapooians are going to stay, the Chinook people are going to stay. It ended up that the Umpquas actually stayed, most of them did. The Shastas and other Rogue River peoples, and Rogue River is again as a gloss. The Rogue Rivers are Shasta, Athabascan, Takelma, and some Cow Creek Umpqua peoples, which are actually Takelma speakers. So that's there's many different tribes, different languages involved in them. So that's kind of what happened. And there originally were already farm sites and buildings set up. These likely became the buildings or the houses of the chiefs, because they were always promised more stuff. So there you go. So U.S. then began trying to figure out what to do with these Native people on reservations. At this point in the 1850s, the tribes were starting to cost some money, because there were going to be hundreds of these reservations across the United States, and that increased the overhead of the federal government. And the government didn't see anything of getting anything out of it. Of course, nobody would mention that they got a bunch of land out of that, but yeah, so they wanted to figure out what to do with them. So they thought, well, maybe we can assimilate them, make them part of our population. We need to get rid of the savage in them, make them, like white Christian Americans at the time was a big popular thing. And so they began to impose different levels of assimilation. I call it 3 legs of assimilation. Education of the kids in schools, which is always a Christian education at the time, because most of your educators were trained in some sort of Christian education. Having the adults become farmers, which would rapidly turn them into sort of American farmers, because that's the American farming system, and imposing missionaries among them. And the U.S. government actually assigned missionaries from different churches to each reservation. Grand Ronde got the Catholics, Sluts got the Methodists. I don't know what that means. Is that funny? I don't know. So, yeah, and that happened across. There was a document I found. I was looking through federal records in D.C., and literally there's a list of all these reservations, and they just assigned. And the reason why they did this is that all the different denominations were squabbling about access to the tribes, and so when they did the assignment, the squabbling stopped. So there you go. It's just like high school, Okay, so agriculture was imposed among tribes. Most of the people became farmers. They wanted to become farmers. They saw the value in that. The problem was, at the reservation, the land at Grand Ronde, I don't know if you know, is pretty bad. It's mostly clay. So you couldn't really grow really good crops there and make a living there. Nowadays, when the tribe actually has land and they grow crops, they're growing hay, because that's all that really grows in any kind of abundance there. And nobody grows any food out there, as far as I know. And unless you bring in soil, you can't even. And then the water sources out there are really bad. So putting people there and saying, okay, I want you to grow half of your food, it just didn't work. Most of the time, the equipment they had was substandard, well used, worn out, was wrong. Apparently the first shipment of plows were absolutely the wrong plows. So they wasted a bunch of thousands of dollars on that. And then they didn't have any seed. And so there were several different time periods, by 1860s, they were talking to Native people, what's wrong with the reservation? And they're all saying, we have no seed, we have no teams of horses, we have no teams of oxen, we have no plows, and we have no land. Nobody had gotten around to assigning land to anybody. So they didn't own anything at all. They were expected to work for the reservation and reservation land, but they didn't own anything themselves. There's nothing they call themselves. So they were kind of upset about that. But later on in the 19th century, they did get some land, first 100 acres in about 1872. And then under the Dawes Act, they got 260 acres in about 1890. And then by the 1880s, because they got their first parcels of land of 100 acres, the agents were saying that the tribes were self-sufficient. The tribes had learned in about a decade and a half that they couldn't depend on the federal government for anything, and so they began to help each other. And there's all these stories on the reservation of people helping out their neighbors if they didn't have kids or a husband or something, to grow crops on their land, and the whole reservation was then put in, as much as possible, was put into agriculture with the help of all of the workers on the reservation together. And so they were doing all that work themselves without any help, and they were also running the grist mill and sawmill without help. It had been rebuilt; those had been rebuilt, and they were doing that without help too. And they were good enough. The report said that they could hire themselves out to run 12 horse teams to plow fields in the area. So they were hiring out their labor to farmers in the area, probably in Amity and some place like that, for plowing and for harvesting things. So they were really good at farming. So people began, accepting this, farming agricultural lifestyle. They had, the reports from the censuses say they had plenty of livestock. They had small vegetable plots on their property. They had, chickens and pigs and everything else, like an American farm. Yet, it was not till 1924 the tribes were ever allowed to become citizens. They had totally changed their life and become like their neighbors, like their white neighbors, and yet they were not allowed to be citizens. They didn't have any rights outside the reservation at all. So that's a pretty crazy thing. They were promised by presidents and by the BIA to get the rights they said they were going to get in the treaties. Treaties promised them, help, and promised them to get land, and promised them, to teach them how to farm. And then later on, presidents were like, if you become like your neighbors, Christian farmers, or worthwhile, civilized people, we're going to make you citizens. But that didn't happen until 1924. So that's just way too long. So the whole area was sort of reinscribed by settlers. The first change is taking away native culture. Once you took away the burning on the land, that causes an effect on the plants and the animals and everything that depends on that burning every year to keep things clean, to keep things going in the cycle. There are reports from the 1860s of, like invasions by locusts, of crazy things happening on land, big fires within 15 to 20 to 25 years after that, probably caused by the lack of fire on the land and the buildup of fuels, and that became a huge problem. And then the settlers inscribed this new method, this agricultural method on the land, which didn't just mean plowing it, but also changing water systems around. And we'll get into that right now. So what happened is there began a huge project, first experimental, to figure out how to drain the land. The land, like I said, was completely full, like waterways and swales and swamps and marshes and what have you. It was really, really wet and watery because there was so much rain and so much, snowpack melt into the valley that we had tons of water here. And that made the season for, let's say, farmers very short. They could grow just in the middle of the summertime, but then when the rains come, like today, all of a sudden, that small pond in the middle of your property becomes a giant swale that destroys all the crops around it. So they were very upset about that. They wanted to find a way to build drain fields and to drain off the land faster so they could have more arid land, and that would lengthen their season out for the rest of summer to grow European crops on. So, and that's what they did. But by doing that, they destroyed, habitat for wapato, for camas. They also destroyed habitat for massive amounts of ducks. And since we're in Duck Central, people were maybe concerned about that. So all that habitat for ducks was destroyed. Created, again, arid landscape. It was terraforming, but it caused a kind of erosion, channelized creeks, and then all that water goes out to the ocean faster. So it's just crazy to say when I hear like reports that we're going through some sort of drought because we caused it. The people here caused that. Water did not stay here. So So water goes out more quickly to the ocean. So for example, Lake Wildish in Salem, this is what it used to look like, and it's not like that anymore. It's used to be this giant, swampy, marshy, lakey thing that was long, about 10 miles long, just north of Salem, came off the Pudding River. Today it's all this, onion fields. A few orchards, mostly onion fields, wall-to-wall onions, things like that. This is later in the summer. This is Lake Wildish, the bottom of Lake Wildish. And just recently I was able to find that one farmer who had been growing onions decided to stop doing that, and he got some money from, Ducks Unlimited and other folks to restore his land, put it back into restoration. He got paid for that. He said he got paid as much to do that as he would make growing onions. But this has come back. This is Wapato. It came back after being destroyed for something like 80 to 100 years. The lake was destroyed by 1918. It's back. Yeah, there's 4 large plots like this. This is later in the summer, and then here's Wapato. It's probably not as healthy as it could be. It's not inundated with water, but clearly it's there. So it was not planted. He didn't plant it. It just came back. So Lake Wapato, or Wapato Lake, is in the middle of being restored today. I think it's been opened this last year, technically as a new project, new park. I think there's a trail around it. There's no real lake there yet. There used to be a giant lake in Tualatin County, outside of, south of Hillsboro, by Gaston. The tribes wanted it for their reservation originally in 1851 because it was a giant resource. It was full of Wapato like this. This is not a picture of it, but this is probably what it looked like. And the reports from the newspapers that I was able to dredge up said that there was thousands and thousands of canvas-back ducks that came there to eat and the stories are crazy. So they said that the people of Portland, the rich people in Portland that were in business or whatever, they would take off on the weekend to go to this lake, and they had these duck blinds around the lake, and they would shoot the ducks in the lake, and they would never collect the carcasses. And the farmers were kind of upset about that. So by 1935, it was actually drained off and destroyed. And the whole Wildish and Wapato Lake were both drained off by the same family. This family of land barons that came from California. They bought 1,000 acres at Lake Wildish. They spent their own money, $100,000, to ditch it out to the 6-mile ditch to the Willamette. And then once that land became arid, all of a sudden the price of it went boom. And they sold it all, and then they bought land here. And they did the same thing here, and they did the same thing. They sold it all. So it was a big land deal to increase the value of the land, and make it more arid, make it more farmland. And all of a sudden your land prices go crazy because, I don't know if you guys been to Lake Wildish before, but the soil is literally black because there's so much nutrient in that soil from thousands of years of all the plant life and animal life, going down. So, and actually they've only used like the surface for farming. If you get digging down, there's still like layers of Mazama ash in there and stuff. So it goes down like deep, and it's all like nutrient-rich soil. It's crazy. So that's probably the same with Wapato Lake too. So I did my own little project. We're kind of near the end here. So my own little project with watching. I was kind of trying to figure out, because we've been disconnected from our land, the tribes, by assimilation, by a land being taken away, but not ever inheriting any land. Not ever. My tribe, my people, never were allowed to have farmland of our own. That was not being taken away by the government at some point. So we have no 100-year century farms at all in our tribe. And so I began in the last few years relearning, what was native plant life? What does it do in the summertime? So this is camas when it's first coming up in like early May. And you can see this is also juncus around here in this field around Salem. And then here's what the field looked like like the first week of May. And then the next week there was a rain that year, a couple of years ago now, and all of a sudden we have a swale. And I've seen this a couple times. So this was gone in 3 days. But if somebody had their crops here, it would destroy their crops, right? So this is what we're talking about in terms of like these summer, what they call freshettes, rains that would come, create a swale, and then it would disappear again by being drained out to the rivers. But that would happen more often in the past than now. And then there we are, it's all drained off. There's a little bit of water on the path, but everything's fine. The camas is fine. In the late summer, we see camas still blooming. This is your giant camas at the height of the grasses in the prairie. In fact, just above that height. So they are really, really good competitors for attention, from bees and everything else. So that's pretty cool. Really, really tall sometimes. That's probably a good 6 feet high. That's pretty good. And then this is what they look like late in the summer when they turn, when the seed pods develop and they dry up, they sound like little bells. So I'm following the cycle to figure out what happens in the summertime. And so at this point, it's not necessarily carried away by birds. Probably, any kind of disturbance walking through that field shakes everything up. And so, deer, anything, even wind will disturb them enough to spread them around. But they don't spread them very far. They're not floating. They're just going to go down to the floor, onto the ground. And so, it's pretty cool. So there are lots of challenges to this, to what we're doing here, trying to restore people's knowledge about Native peoples, about the environment around us, about what the Native environment was like. It's kind of unconscionable to sort of begin with no knowledge of the past, no environmental history, and move forward. So we have to really go back and look. So most people, though, begin with no knowledge of history of the tribes at all, or culture of the tribes. And many people make assumptions because of that, and many times they're wrong. Native histories have not been appropriately recorded, even by historians. Most don't have Native perspectives of historic events and effects of colonization on tribal peoples. In most history books, 99% of them, they never went and talked to Native peoples about their own history. They just assumed things. Native history and culture is not being appropriately taught in our school education systems. There are free modules online right now, and have been online for years, like 5 years now, and nobody that I know of is actually using those modules still in schools, because schools don't have time, they don't have will, they don't have money for education or for trainings. They don't have a lot of things that they need, but there's no real impetus to teach it besides, if you guys go complain. So, and we don't really have memories of the time before written history. So those of you that are surprised about Lake Wildish and Wapta Lake, join the party. I grew up in Salem. I grew up around a place, near a place called Lake Wildish, and I never saw it as a lake. All I ever saw was onion fields. And it didn't occur to me that there was something else going on until a couple of years ago. So that's where we're at. A lot of this stuff has never been written down, not recorded. Nobody's told it, and the return of cultural fire is one dimension of restoration. We also need to return water to the land and allow water to remain in the land to truly restore the environment, if that's what we're doing. And decolonization is always a disruption of all we know and think we know. So just think about that. If we're trying to change the way we think about the land, you gotta disrupt what you think you know. And I think that's it. Goodbye, thank you.